I want to go to chapter 42, and I want to talk about a guilty conscience, because you've never had one, and you probably don't know what they are. But for those of you who may have, sinned, guilty conscience, let's just talk that one through. There are some truths, and I picked out 8 of them in the passage, truths about a guilty conscience. And the first truth that I picked out comes from 42, 1 and 2. And I think you'll understand right away where I'm going with this, but we can spot a guilty conscience in our life if we're slow to act because we know we have something to hide. I'm not sure a way to condense that, but just to say, here's a truth about a guilty conscience. It slows your actions. When you have a guilty conscience, it slows you from doing right because you have something nagging you. One of the reasons that sin in your life will affect you as a Bible teacher is there are things you won't be able to say well when you know you're not living them. They'll bother you. As a Bible teacher, may I just say, I know this. Okay? 42:1. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, "Why are you staring at one another?" This is an odd thing to be saying. He said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some from that place so that we may live and not die." I want you to note that if you were to read very carefully the end of chapter 41, you would see that the famine wasn't only in Egypt, it was across the Middle East. And it went over into the Negev in the land where Jacob was. Tell me something. Why were the boys looking at each other rather than getting up and going and saving the family by going to Egypt? Because that brings back the skeleton in the closet they're hiding, which is, by the way, Joe didn't die, he got sold and sent into Egypt. For fear that anybody might recognize them or know something or the story may come back, guilt is there, slowing them down. And the key to understanding this hesitant reaction is, what role has Egypt played in the lives of these men up till now? Egypt was the destination of where our brother ended up. By the way, they knew exactly where the Ishmaelites with the camels were going. That was clear in the story. Did you ever do something really stupid, but think, you know what, I don't know these people, and I'm never going to see them again anyway, so what's the difference? Now imagine that somebody says, hey, let's go back there. So those whose guilt within their bosoms lie, imagine every eye beholds their shame. Little Shakespearean line there for you. Whenever you're really guilty, you feel like everybody in the room is looking at you and they all know. Second truth I picked out was in verse 3. This one is we have to recognize that guilty consciences have left questionable character marks, even in the hearts of those who love us. When we've done things and we have a guilty conscience, something is wrong. And people who don't even know what is wrong know something is wrong. Let me show you this in verse 3, maybe it'll be clearer. The 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. I love the way Moses, when he's penning this out, mentions who they are. The 10 brothers of Joseph, not the boys that are Jacob's sons. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. What is that? There's a tremendous, positive, huge lesson that has happened in Jacob's life. How do I know? He's much more cautious about the young one because he lost Joe. Now Joseph, he would have just sent him to be with his brothers. Why is he cautious sending him with his brothers? Who is he afraid of? The Egyptians? I don't think so. I think he's afraid of sending him off the young one with the brothers, because that didn't play out well. I think that the guilty conscience, even though they never told their dad what they did, I think he wondered about it the rest of his life. He wasn't sure about all the other boys. I think it's not as easy to hide guilt as you think. I think that, did any of you ever have the experience, I don't know if your mom was like mine, but my mom just always knew. She always knew. If I did something wrong, she just knew. I don't know how she knew, but she did. And then I married Dottie, and guess what? She always knows. And it's scary how she knows. Here's the thing. When Jacob is grabbing onto this thing, Jacob loved his boys, but it's clear that their track record made them somewhat untrustworthy in his eyes. And Jacob knew the boys enough to hesitate to trust them, and I think that's really the lingering effect here. Now, what about their estranged brother? Have they changed? Look at verse 5 for a second. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. So now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed to him with their faces to the ground. This isn't coincidence. God has staged to bring them right into Joseph. But Joseph is ruling Egypt. Now you have to understand, if they had taken a good look at Joseph, they might have thought they might have known him. There's no way they're even going to look in this guy's eyes. He's in charge of Pharaoh, and they keep their eyes to the ground. It's a perfect setup. It's perfect, because there's nothing in their mind. The last time they saw Joe, he was in a hole, and he was being sold off to a bunch of Ishmaelites. They're not expecting him to come back and see a guy in silk robes with gold. Somehow the bling threw them off. So then it says in verse 7, when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. But Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said, "You are spies. You have come back to look at the undefended parts of our land." Then they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men." Oh, that's just beautiful. Your servants are not spies. I think they could have done well by leaving the honest men part out. I think they could have done well if they'd have just said, "No, we didn't come to steal." It's the honest men part that's going to get Joseph a little exercised. Yet he said to them, "No, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of the land." But they said, "Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive." It's interesting. He starts probing and pushing, and out pops out of their mouth, "One's dead." He never asked. What I want you to understand is that they are feeling so guilty that this is just below the surface and pops out at the first pressure. It's interesting. Joseph said to them, it is as I said to you, you are spies. But by this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, that he may get your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested whether there's truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. So he put them all together in prison for 3 days. This is just a little, hey, how about a taste of my life? And Joseph said to them on the 3rd day, "Do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison. But as for the rest of you, go, carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words may be verified, and you will not die." And they did so. Joe obviously didn't naturally trust his brothers. I mean, come on, you're not expecting him to, are you? They had shown their colors years before, but if you look closely at his dealings with his brothers, it's worth noting the way he handled them. He spoke harshly to them. He put them in jail. He insisted the younger brother come. He confined one brother. He offered no comfort, just a business transaction. Was Joe still sore? I don't think so. I think he used the elements of what changed him to test them. That's what I think he did. It looks to me like he took them through a quick version of his own life. There are indications that Joe had to work to see his own life change. And if you look back all the way back to Genesis 41, Joseph had 2 sons, and he named the first one Manasseh, forgetting, resolving. What is Manasseh to Joe? He's having children, and he's saying, I'm resolving this. And what's interesting is, I really think that Ephraim is the word for fruitful, but it's from the same word as aphir, which is the word bandage. I think what's interesting is that I don't think we're stretching it too far afield to indicate that Joe got the order right, that we don't get fruitful until we actually resolve the things from our past. I think his first child was resolution, and his second child was fruitfulness. I think there's really something there. I'm not going to play it out, but I just think that it's worth noting something's going on with the guy. Joe's moving on in life, and God saw, and Joe saw God as using his defeats and setbacks to get him to where he was, but he was still supposed to cling to the Lord. Now, stop there, and before you go to verse 21, consider this for a second. Here's a truth that I think is the third truth of the passage. I think we have to take our guilty consciences and face the past. Because I think guilt leaves us weakened and uncertain, and that's not how we belong. I think we have to resolve our guilt and face our past. So it says in verse 21, then they said to one another, truly we are guilty. That's how I picked that out as the theme of the passage. Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, and yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. Look at the old memory that they picked out. They're not picking out that they sold him into slavery. They're not picking out that they lied to their dad. They're picking out one feature of the story. What was the feature of the story? The pleading of Joseph before they sold him to the Ishmaelites. They're picking the thing that haunted them all those 13 years. The thing that haunted them was his voice in their ears, pleading them not to do this to him. And because they spoke harshly to him, he spoke harshly back to them to give them some of that same thing. You know, I think if you keep going in the passage, what you'll see is I love the author that wrote, forgiveness brings healing. It sets someone free from the chains and burdens and years of bondage. He says, have you hated, have you despised, have you begrudged someone for weeks, months, or years? Set them free. Find relief for yourself. Make brothers of your enemies. I always liked that. I just thought it was good. Look at the boys standing in front of Joe. I mean, and speaking to one another about their own guilt. Joe's about to let them go free, but they were already enslaved. They've been enslaved for 13 years, listening to his voice in their ears. They're going to get a chance to say it to Joe when the time comes, but the rehearsal was with one another. Do you see what they're doing? They're rehearsing their guilt out loud with one another. This is the first time in the Bible you hear them actually admitting guilt and saying it out loud to one another. And guess what? In just a few short chapters, they're going to be admitting it in front of the person they did it to. Sometimes it helps to say it out loud. Sometimes it helps to put words on it. Now, there's a fourth truth, and this one is another place to spot a guilty conscience is when our mouths play the blame game. Very often people place blame on other people because they feel like they're guilty. And guilty people often blame others. So look at Reuben. Now, verse 22. Now, what is Reuben's role? Reuben was the benefactor of the loss of Joe. How? How did Reuben gain when Joe was lost? He got his birthright back. So Reuben answered them, saying, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood. It's interesting. Be careful if you're searching for your mind for somebody more culpable than yourself. Irma Bombeck, the writer, calls guilt the gift that keeps on giving. It leads to other sinful practices, and it looks for someone lower to blame. So here's the guy at the head of the pack saying, I told you guys not to be doing that. Well, that's not exactly. If you go back and read what he said don't kill him. He didn't say don't sell him into slavery. You know, barbarians, cavemen, and headhunters do not forgive. It takes a wise, kind, and godly man to forgive. When I get down to verse 23, here's what I see. Here's a fifth truth. The fifth one is, don't forget that in our guilt, we can easily ignore the ones we left hurting until the pain becomes real to us. Very often, guilt is a way of self-loathing, but it's not about the person we hurt. It's about how we feel. It's selfishness. Now, watch this in verse 23. They did not know, however, that Joseph understood. They're standing there speaking Hebrew to each other, and guess what? Joe speaks Hebrew. They just don't know that. There was an interpreter between them. He turned away from them, and he wept. But when he turned to them and spoke, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. The boys were sharing their pain, but neglected to notice Joseph's pain. That wasn't the first time that they didn't see his tears, by the way. They had grown up learning not to see his tears. Look at verse 25. Let me give you a sixth one. I want you to take note of something. Guilty consciences lead us to believe the wrong thing about God. His work to get us to face our guilt can seem like he's against us. That's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to get us back to a place where we're on the right page with him. But look at verse 25. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. And thus it was done for them. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed from there. As one of them had opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of the sack. Then he said to his brothers, my money has been returned, and behold, it's even in my sack. And their hearts sank, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? Notice what happened? Well, boys, since you ask, I'll tell you what God's been saving since your past. What he's doing is he's securing your future. That's what God is doing. But that's not what it looks like to them. It looks like to them that God is setting them up for a fall. That's what it looks like. Why? Because they've spent so long being guilty that they're not walking with God and they don't understand how God works. An undeserved blessing is always suspect in a guilty heart. Undeserved blessing is always suspect in a guilty heart. The seventh one, I think, I picked up in verse 29. The seventh truth is guilty consciences often protest of their innocence, but they leave deep mistrust in all the subsequent situations. They protest. When somebody protests too much, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, and they keep coming back to it, often there's a tell. If you've ever watched people play poker, you know that there's a tell. Certain people have a certain thing that they do that tells whether or not their hand is weak or strong. Verse 29 says, when they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies of his country. But we said to him, we are honest men. We are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no longer alive, and the youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan. The man, the Lord of the land, said to us, by this I will know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, and take grain for the famine of your households, and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you are not spies, but honest men. I will give your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Now it came about, as we were emptying our sacks, that behold, every man's bundle was in his sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were dismayed. Their father Jacob said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin? All things are against me. He's looking at him and he's going, I don't have anybody to stand with me. You guys, Jacob is not ready to trust the boys before with Ben. Now they lost another brother, and they're asking him to now give him Ben. Are you kidding me? You lost Simeon in the last round, and now you want to take the last? No! I think the other problem is that they kept claiming to be honest men, and I think that bugged their dad. I don't think he thought they were honest men. I think he thought that they were manipulative killers whenever it suited them, because I think he's already seen that in their past. What do you mean you're honest men? Did you not deceive the Hivites and kill off a whole bunch of them? What are you forgetting your history? Because I don't think you're all that honest. The last one in the chapter. Guilty consciences cannot be restored without trusting one who is willing to pay the price. The way you restore it is somebody has to be willing to step up and pay the price. And that means they got to come clean. I want you to look at verse 37. Reuben. Oh, this is going to be precious, right? Reuben spoke to his father, "You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you." Wait a minute. Reuben? Reuben was responsible last time. How could Reuben guarantee it? Reuben is now taking a personal stake in it. Dad, I'm not going to let it happen. I'm going to look in the eye and I'm going to tell you, you can take my kids and kill them. You can take my future away from me. If that's what you need to do, that's what I'm willing. But Jacob said, "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray hair down to the grave in sorrow." Sheol is the grave. Now, I want you to note that Reuben did not have groupthink here. This was personal responsibility. I want you to note that, because in every other situation we've seen Reuben, he was either in groupthink or he was in bed with somebody. Everything else, he doesn't take personal responsibility. This is the first time he steps up. He takes leadership that should have been there years before. And solving the guilty conscience takes stepping up to the plate and acting differently than everybody else. You can't lead and be what everybody else is. It takes surrendering your future. It takes setting everything down and saying, I am going to accomplish this. In our case, it has to start with the one that we've wronged the most. You're never going to fix your guilty conscience without pledging to the one you've wronged. And in our case, the one we've wronged the most is the Lord God of heaven. So we got to lay it down or we're never going to solve the problem. I think when David said in Psalm 51, "Lord, against you only have I sinned," doesn't that bug you? Wait a minute. How about Uriah? You sinned against him. How about Bathsheba? You sinned against her. No, that's what he's saying is, compared to the way I sinned against them, I sinned against you so much more. You have to understand that Hebrew has no comparatives. You can't say good, better, best. You don't have a way to say it. In modern Hebrew, when you say yoter tov, you say more good. That's how you say good and more good. But in antiquity, they didn't have a way to say it. So Mary has chosen the good part, as if Martha serving the meal is a bad part. No, the better part, but there's no way to say it in the language. Okay? So you have a problem with comparatives all the way through the Bible. Here I see something very interesting. I see that Reuben steps up and he takes responsibility. I want you to understand something. Jesus didn't just come to take your punishment, he also came to take your guilt. That comes with the package. Okay? Questions about the guilty conscience? I hope by now, and this really isn't a class designed for me to tell you what I found in the passage. It's just an example of what you're supposed to be doing. So I hope that what you're grabbing onto as we go further in the classes, this is how you do it. You look for the heartbeat of the passage. You look for what is going on in the passage. And it seems to me that guilt was like telltale heart beating beneath the floor, for Edgar Allan Poe. It just sounds like the whole thing's kind of freakishly dum-dum, 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 And I think the guilt is the point of the story. It's likely that a childhood accident caused poet Elizabeth Barrett to lead a life of semi-invalidism before she married Robert Browning in 1846. There's more to the story. In her youth, Elizabeth had watched over her tyrannical father. She was watched over by him, Elizabeth was the eldest of their 12 children, 8 boys and 4 girls. When she and Robert were married, their wedding was held in secret because of her father's disapproval. After the wedding, the Brownings sailed for Italy, where they lived the rest of their lives. But even though her parents had disowned her, Elizabeth never gave up on the relationship with her mom and dad. Almost weekly, she wrote them letters. Not once did they reply. After 10 years, she received a large box in the mail. Inside, Elizabeth found all of her letters. Not one of them had been opened. She died and was buried in the English cemetery of Florence, Italy. The collection of her last poems was published by her husband shortly after her death. They are now known as among the most beautiful in classical English literature. Had her parents only read a few of them, their relationship with Elizabeth might have been restored. I don't know if you know Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but if you know any of her poems, they were actually written to her parents, and they were all broken-hearted poems. They were all longing to be in their life again. The big thing she did wrong, she married the guy she loved. And it's a story that we tell in Florence, but the reason I put it here is there are ingredients involved in reconciliation. So what you just saw in the last chapter was not reconciliation. What you saw was dealing with guilt. And dealing with guilt is necessary to coming to reconciliation, but it's not the same thing. They haven't been put back together yet. In fact, when we left off in the story, the boys are apart. The boys are with their father, and Simeon's in prison, and Joe is running Egypt. So the family's spread out over two places. Reconciliation happens when everybody's at the same place. So let me make some observations as I start to look at, just a little bit about how this reconciliation comes together. First, I want you to notice that when you're looking at 42, and we walked through chapter 42 and how they were asked to go, and in 43 how they were brought together. But I want you to notice, when you look through it, the salvation of Jacob section is what 42 to 50 is called. Why is 42 to 50 called by theologians the salvation of Jacob? In a way, the end of Jacob's life and the losing of his child Joseph was almost like a bewilderingly lost experience for him. And when Jacob finds that Joseph is alive, it's a rebirth. And there's this dramatic thing. I'm not trying to make it spiritual. I'm trying to say, in his life, as a believer and follower of God, the last part of his life was absolutely horrendously hard to face. You know, you can walk with God for years, and that doesn't mean you're not going to lose some of the people you love the most. It probably means you will. All things getting equal, the last part of your life is about loss. Are we all sure about that? Basically, you're losing your friends and then you die. And the reason I end with you dying is because after that, you're still losing friends, except for you're dead. So the point is that the last part of life, just like the first part of life is all about the joy of life, the last part of life is also about the heavy weight of losing people in your life. And one of the things that drives people down is this heavy weight of loss. I think one of the things you have to look at is the last part of his life, this has been very hard for him. I also think we don't really know how God will accomplish his purposes in our lives, and he teaches us through all these operations of life. And we meet people under construction at different periods of their life, but in the last encounter, Joe is testing the boys and sending them off, and you're spies. No, we're honest men. It's interesting. Everything that's coming out of their mouths is actually leading them to a place where they understand what they've done. I think that actually going to Egypt again, the place, the experience, the unnerving of what Joseph did to them, the prison experience, all of that, I think, brought out all these old skeletons out of the closet. And they recognized that it was time for them to have put hope into action and bring back reconciliation. So I want to go to 43 for a minute, and I want to just take a moment and say that tests sometimes reveal hidden things that are hidden in the closet. So pressure comes on the situation, and it reveals something that's long since been hidden. And they force a brother to take responsibility. So halfway through 43, what you have is, I myself will be surety for him. You may hold me responsible. What you start seeing emerging out of the story is that they start coming forward and taking some responsibility for what happened. But the test forced Jacob to recall the control of God, and that was a struggle that he had for years. Don't miss that in 11 to 15, stop there, 43:11. Their father Israel said to them, if it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best products of the land in your bags and carry them down to a man as a present. a little balm, a little honey, aromatic gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. By the way, biblical scholars love these passages because it tells us what they're eating and what they're transporting. And then it says, take double the money in your hand and take back in your hand the money that was returned in the mouth of the sacks. Perhaps it was a mistake. Take your brother also and arise, return to the man, and may God Almighty grant you compassion. That's the moment. What just happened? You see that the problem brought out some revealed things, some hidden things and revealed them. And you see that the problem was with Dad struggling to let them go, with the boys struggling to be responsible, and then one of them takes a half step and says, I'll be responsible. I will take the responsibility. But look at the key to the passage. The key is, may God grant you compassion in the sight of the man, so that he will release to you your older brother and Benjamin. As for me, listen to the words of Jacob, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. If God takes them, then he takes them. Wow. What is that moment for Jacob? Think about his life and where he's been. Think about the breaking of relationship with Esau and the restoration of it. Think about the limp he's carrying. If you had to go back and put a star over Jacob's life and say, here's the meaning of Jacob's life, it was a battle for control. Manipulation was about control, and this was about surrender. Jacob's life, here he surrenders what's left of his life. All right, take my sons. All right, I'm going to trust God, and it's either going to work or it's not. So the men took this present. They took double the money in their hand, and Benjamin, and they arose and they went down to Egypt, and they stood before Joseph. By the time they get into verse 16, this is the dramatic moment. Now, in Jacob's life, Jacob has been broken. In Jacob's life, he's already surrendered everything he has left. There is nothing Jacob has left that he hasn't given God. How do I know? He just surrendered everything he's got. Cash, prizes, sons, everything that matters to him is gone. If these guys don't come back, frankly, Jacob doesn't care if he eats or sleeps because it doesn't matter. And his life is over if they don't come back. So Jacob now is set aside in the story as fully surrendered. Go on with the story, and the test took all the control from the brothers and placed them in fear and vulnerability. Now the brothers have to learn what they just saw their father do. You're not in charge. You're not in control. So take a look at it. It says, when Joseph saw Benjamin with him, he said to his house steward, bring the men into the house and slay an animal and make it ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. So the man did as Joseph said and brought the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, it is because of the money that was returned in our sacks the first time that we are being brought in, that he may seek occasion against us and fall upon us and take us as slaves, take us for slaves with our donkeys. Well, I always thought that was funny. It's like their last thought was about their donkeys. I'm not really sure why. So they came near to Joseph's house steward, got real close to him, spoke to him at the entrance of the house and said, my lord, we indeed came down the first time to buy food, and it came about when we had come to the lodging place that we opened our sacks, and behold, each man's money was in the mouth of his sack, and our money in full. So we brought it back in our hand. We've also brought down other money in our hand to buy food. We do not know who put our money in our sacks. And he said, be at ease, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money. Then he brought Simeon out to them. So in essence, he deceives them because he's setting them up. He's actually still understanding their vulnerability. And he is compelled to use what he's doing to try and see who they are. He's still not sure what's going on with his brothers. He wants to know who's going ahead, who's moved on, who's become honest, who's gotten right with God. He doesn't know. So the only thing he can do is he can test it. What I think is interesting is the test was set up so that Joe could learn some critical lessons. he says, then the man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet, and he gave their donkeys fodder. So they prepared the present for Joseph's coming at noon, for they had heard that they were to eat a meal there. When Joseph came in, they brought into the house to him the present which was in their hand, and bowed to the ground before him, and he asked them about their welfare. Is your old father well, of whom you spoke? Is he still alive? They said, your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive. They bowed down in homage. As he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, he said, is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? And he said, may God be gracious to you, my son. So Joseph hurried out, for he was deeply stirred over his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber, and he wept there, and he washed his face, and he came out, and he controlled himself and said, serve the meal. So they served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for it is loathsome to the Egyptians. I think that's great. The whole place is run by a Hebrew, but they're not allowed to eat with them because Hebrews are like, dirty. And so verse 33 says, now they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in astonishment. He took portions to them from his own table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. So they feasted and drank freely with him. Now, God brought them together, and God put them in order. There they were. And the prime minister of Egypt has a banquet prepared, and then according to verse 33, he had them seated. They sat before him, firstborn according to his birthright, youngest according to his youth. What's interesting is as the brothers looked around the table, something became incredibly apparent to them and to one another. They were seated in order of their age, oldest to youngest. This can hardly have been a coincidence. Henry Morris in his commentary notes that there were no less than 39,917,000 different orders in which the 11 individuals could have been seated, but they were seated in order. How does he know? How does he know each of them and where they belong? The people were seated and they were told where to sit. How does he know? And he got the order exactly right. This is the first time in 20 years that all 12 brothers have been in the same place at the same time, but only one of them is aware of it. That's a great story. Everybody there, first time they're all back together. It's a big family reunion except for only one person knows. So what does he do? He gets up and plays favorites just like his dad. God ordered the family, but Joe loved his whole brother more than he loved his half-brothers. Guys, as you've been reading through the patriarchs, do you just see this theme coming up over and over again? He also knows something. Ben had nothing to do with his captivity. Benjamin's the one brother who had nothing to do with him being put in slavery. So he learned that being led by passion was not the best move. It caused his trouble. Simeon's imprisonment was a reflection that Joe may have gone a bit too far. So Simeon had been a family problem since the Hamor incident with Shechem. It seems like the family rested while Simeon was in prison, but it may have been a passion response, and that wasn't the most reliable faculty. It's interesting. He gets ready for reconciliation. Now, this isn't the only thing that's going to happen. In 44 and 45, when we come back, we're going to see a setup, and then a plea, and then actions, and then reconciliation. Why all the games? Why is it taking Joe so long to say, I'm Joseph, whom you sold into slavery? He'll do it, but not here. Why is he waiting? This time, it was all about getting to meet somebody that he hadn't seen. He just wanted his brother Benjamin. That's what he wanted. But his end game is to do what? I'm sorry? To get his father. Why? When his father comes, he will give the one line that defined the whole back end of his life. You meant for evil what God meant for good. Don't worry. He brought me here to save you. You thought you were throwing me into a jail or into a prison or into a slavery or into a trouble or into a... But God was saving you. Sometimes your worst mistake can be the thing God is going to use the most in your life. You have no idea. God is not limited to only your good stuff. He can take from some of your worst stuff and make that your blessing. So I want you to kind of close down with this, and as we move on, we're going to come back and we're going to look at 44 and 45. And one of the things that has to happen is God can mend what nobody can mend, and that's a broken heart. He can reach into the pain from years ago and rescue what you can't rescue yourself. He can fix and reconcile things that no man can fix. But he's going to take his time. So we're going to go through from the first visit in 42, the second visit in 43, and 44 and 45, and will finally get us to the place where we get back together, Jacob and Joseph in the same room.